Okay, so we are going to be looking at payroll. So we're going to be calculating employees' pay and their earnings. Okay, so a wage is an amount that I make per hour. So if I'm paid hourly, I'm making a wage. A salary is an amount that I get paid annually, so every single year, and that's split up throughout the year equally. A commission is an amount that I make off of the sales that I make. So I might get commission of 10% based off of all the sales that I make. My total earnings are all of my earnings that I make from my wages or my salary plus any commission that I make as well. Total earnings can also be referred to as gross pay, gross wages, or gross earnings. Okay, so a pay period is just the number of days or weeks that I work that are covered by this paycheck. So it's a certain period of time that I work that I get this paycheck for. Okay, there's lots of different kinds of pay periods. I could be paid weekly, I could be paid every 2 weeks, I could be paid twice a month, or just once a month. Okay, so my payroll is the total amount that an employer pays all of their employees. So it's the total of all of your employees' pay. The payroll clerk is the person who's actually processing that payroll. They're the ones who are computing all of these numbers and posting that payroll. Right, so a time clock, it's just a device that I use, and it's going to record the date and time that each of my employee arrives and departs. So a lot of retail businesses, maybe restaurant businesses, they're going to use a time clock where you're going to punch in and it's going to record when you got there and when you leave. A lot of businesses now, they just use timesheets. You fill in the time that you were there and you turn that in as a piece of paper. All right, so here's an example of a timesheet. So it shows what time they arrived in the morning, what time they left. Maybe they came in for a couple hours and left, and then came back in the afternoon and left. Maybe it has a lunch break in there. It's going to show the total hours that they worked, and then any overtime that they worked as well. Okay. Here is an example of a time clock system. So the time clock, you go in, you punch into that time clock. This is actually going to give you a printout of all of those different transactions in that time clock. Okay, so now we need to calculate our total earnings. So we take the number of regular hours that employee works and multiply it by their regular rate of pay. Okay, to calculate our overtime rate, we take that regular rate of pay, the $15, and we just multiply that by 1.5. So their overtime rate would be $22.50. Now to calculate their overtime earnings, we take the number of overtime hours that they worked, so 6 hours and 6.5 hours, and we multiply that by the overtime rate that was calculated. Okay, to calculate our total earnings, we take our regular earnings, and this should be adding it to the overtime earnings, not multiplying it. So this should be an addition. Okay, so we are adding our regular earnings to our overtime earnings, not multiplying them. So they worked overtime. All right, so now we are going to do the work together. We are on page 350. Okay, so they tell us the October 15th time card for Alice R. Webster and the time card data for the other employees are provided. So in number 1, they calculate the regular, overtime, and total hours worked. So I need to calculate the regular, overtime, and total hours that are worked by Miss Webster. Any hours over 8 hours per day or 40 hours per week are considered overtime. Right? Each of the work weeks begins on Monday. I need to record the total hours on the time card. Okay, so we need to figure out how many hours they worked. So when we're looking at this, we are going to round the hours to the nearest half hour. So we're going to just kind of quickly figure out what these hours are. So if we look at this first one on Monday the 1st, they clocked in just a little bit before 7 a.m. Then they clocked out just a little bit before noon. They clocked back in at a little bit before 1 and then clocked out just a little bit after 5. Okay, so they would have worked 4 hours in the morning, went to lunch for an hour, and then came back and worked for 4 more hours in the afternoon. So they are going to be working a total of 8 hours that day. Okay, on Tuesday the 2nd, they had about the same schedule. They worked 8 hours that day. On Wednesday the 3rd, they worked the same 8 hours. Right, on the 4th, so they came in the morning for 4 hours and then in the afternoon for 4 hours again. So they had 8 regular hours, but then they came back in the afternoon or in the evening from 6 to 9:30. So they worked another 3.5 hours. Okay, Friday, they didn't work in the morning, they came in the afternoon and then again in the evening. So they worked a total of 8 hours. Right, Monday the 8th, they worked 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the afternoon, so 8 hours total. Okay, so Tuesday the 9th, they worked 4 hours in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they didn't leave until 6, so they ended up actually working for 5 hours that afternoon. So they worked 8 regular hours plus 1 overtime hour. Right, on the 10th, they worked 4 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, so 8 total. The 11th, they worked 4 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, so 8 total. On the 12th, they worked 5 in the morning, but then 3 in the afternoon, but it's still 8 hours total. Okay, so they came in on Saturday, and it looks like they worked 3 hours, so that's going to be considered overtime. Right, Monday the 15th, they worked 4 hours in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, so 8 hours total. Okay. So now I need to total up this pay period. So they worked a total of 88 hours, regular hours, and then 7.5 of overtime hours. Okay, then I'm just going to sign my initials that I approved this amount. Okay, so now on part 2, I need to enter those hours that I just came up with and then calculate earnings for all the rest of the employees. Okay, so we just came up with the hours for Miss Webster, who is employee number 4. She had 88 regular hours and 7.5 overtime. Okay. Now to find my earnings, I'm going to take the regular rate of pay and multiply it by the hours worked. So I'm taking, to figure out my regular hours, I'm going to take the 80 and multiply it by the $9 an hour. Okay, so that's going to give me $720 for my regular rate. I'm going to go ahead and calculate all the rest of the regular rates right now. So 80 hours times the $12.50 is going to give me $1,000. The 70 times the $9.75 would give me $682.50. And then the 88 times the $11 an hour is going to give me $968. Okay, to find my overtime earnings, I would take my regular rate of pay, this $9, and I'm going to multiply it by 1.5 times. So I'd take the $9 times 1.5, and that's going to give me my overtime rate for employee number 1. So their overtime rate is $13.50. Okay, so now to figure out the actual overtime earnings, I take the overtime hours of 5 hours, I multiply it by that $13.50 that I just came up with, and that is going to give me an overtime earnings of $67.50. Okay. Now I need to figure out my overtime earnings for employee number 2. They earn $12.50 per hour regularly. I'm going to multiply that by the 1.5, and that's going to get me $18.75 an hour. So to figure out the overtime earnings for employee number 2, I'm going to take that 3 hours, multiply it by the $18.75 that I just came up with, and that is going to give me $56.25. Okay. Employee number 3, they had 0 hours of overtime, so I'm not going to have any overtime earnings. Right. Employee number 4, their regular rate of pay is $11. So I'm going to multiply that by the 1.5 times, and that's going to give me the overtime rate. Okay, so they make $16.50 an hour for overtime. They had 7.5 hours of overtime. I'm going to multiply that by the 16.5, and that's going to give me $123.75 for the overtime pay. Now I need to calculate my total earnings. I'm just going to add together my regular and my overtime earnings. So I get $787.50, $1,056.25. I didn't have any overtime pay for employee 3, so I'm really not adding anything there. So my total earnings is just the $682.50. Employee 4, I'm going to add those two together. And I'm going to get $1,091.75. Okay, so we just calculated the total earnings for those 4 employees.